So to start at the beginning, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about when you very first, started thinking about making a career as a sound engineer. What was that first spark that got you into recording music?
It was all essentially accidental. Like, all of my association with music stems from me being a fan of it. When I was a teenager, I discovered punk rock through the Ramones, and that got me excited about music. I hadn't really given a shit about music prior to that. Then my circle of friends who were also sort of excited by the Ramones, we formed a band. That got me in the mindset of someone in a musical community as a band member. I moved to Chicago to go to college and got involved in the music scene here. And by that, I mean the punk scene here. And when you're in a band, there's a natural impulse to make recordings of your band so that you have some memory or evidence of what you've done,
Yeah.
And I took it on myself to be the guy in my bands. Like, I was the guy who would do the recordings so that we would have some evidence of what we've been working on, right? And then I developed a minimal skill set for that, and then that made me useful in my peer group to the other people who are all in bands. And so I did demo recordings and rehearsal recordings and stuff for my friends' bands. And that eventually became me making recordings of music that got released on records. And then as those records got disseminated, other people who were like-minded wanted me to work on their records. And the whole thing, I mean, it was just a gradual progression of me being a music fan, then me being in a band, and then me being surrounded by people in bands. And along the way, learning how to do recordings and making myself available as a resource to that community of musicians. And everything around me is just an extension of that. Like, if you keep doing something long enough, eventually you get good at it. And if you make yourself available to people, eventually they'll make use of you. And that's how I ended up with a career. It was never an ambition of mine to be a professional recording engineer. It just happened because it happened because that was I loved it and I wanted to keep doing it, but I always just assumed that I would have some kind of a straight job to pay the rent, and that I would do recordings as I always had, as a peer, as a part of the musical scene, and that I would do it as a side hustle,
Okay. So was there a moment though where you felt like you made some kind of a breakthrough, or where you started to realize you were actually quite good at this, and that people were starting to also realize that fact, when people started coming to you, maybe more so than they were going to their other friends that could also record?
Well, I think there's something that's true for pretty much anybody who does this for a living, which is that you have there's a profound sense of there's a profound sort of imposter syndrome, where, like, I felt that I didn't academically know any of the things that I had learned how to do as a recording engineer. I just learned how to do them, so I felt slightly fraudulent. And you're sort of always in this scenario where you're afraid someone's going to find out that you don't really know what you're doing, that you've been faking it,
Yeah.
And I think that's true in recording more than a lot of other things, because in recording you can get good results just by virtue of you recording a band that were performing well, that were playing well. Like, you make a good recording you make a competent recording of a band that's playing at the peak of their game, and the recording sounds amazing. And it sounds amazing not because you're amazing, but because the band you were recording were amazing. And I benefited from that tremendously, and I knew it. And because I knew that I was being, you know, that the music that I was working with was astonishing music, and the people that I was working with were really smart, it reflected well on me. Like whatever attention I was getting as an engineer was reflected light from people responding to these records that I was doing. There was a moment when I want to say 1987. That sounds like a good guess. Where I had enough work on my calendar as a freelance engineer that I could cover my mortgage for the next few months. Like, I think I had a 3-month window. Like, if I do all of these sessions in the next 3 months, then that will make enough money that I can pay my mortgage, and then I can get to the next 3-month chunk. So I quit my job on the assumption that if the work dried up as an engineer, that I could get my job back, you know. And at the end of that 3-month cycle, I had booked enough additional work to carry on for another 3 months, and another 3 months beyond that, and another 3 months beyond that. So it just, I mean, there was a precipitous timing for a lot of it. Like, I bought my house in Chicago at a time when single family bungalow type houses were extremely cheap. People were looking for multi-unit apartment buildings or big nice houses, and small single family houses were underpriced when I bought my house, which was in the spring of 1986. So then I had a house to operate out of, and I converted the basement into a recording studio. And then eventually I converted the whole house into a recording studio. You know, the attic was the control room, the back of the house was the storage area, the basement was the performing areas. So, I mean, the whole house essentially became a recording studio, and I was living there. And when I was able to move out of the house and buy the building that I'm in now, Electrical Audio, it was in an industrial neighborhood that was fairly abandoned. It was becoming an abandoned industrial neighborhood. So this building was very cheap when I bought it. I bought the whole building for, I want to say $190,000, something like that, which is cheap for America. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, now a building like this would probably cost over $1 million. So, and then there was an inflation after that. There was a real estate boom after that. So, like, a lot of things happened that made it viable for me to have a career as an engineer that were just a matter of lucky timing. Like, I started making records as an independent engineer at a time when it was possible to put together a reasonable recording studio on a budget using semi-professional equipment in a house. And I started that at a time when there was a resurgence in live band recording as an aesthetic, as opposed to the 80s, the beginning of the 80s, middle of the 80s, where things were getting more and more technological, and pop music especially was getting a lot more mechanized and a lot more synthetic. I was in a scene where people were playing live, and where recording a live band was a principal skill that you needed to have as an engineer. You know, whereas I just spent, 5 or 6 years in the trenches doing nothing but that. So I was up to speed on that at a time when a lot of other engineers were having to relearn from first principles how to record live music being performed.
There is this thing that people, artists and fans do refer to as the Steve Albini sound, and whether that's because of the success of something like, In Utero, which propelled that sound a little bit further, perhaps. But I wonder, is there anything else that you can pinpoint that you might do differently, even in your approach or your preparation to a session? Because I feel like if it was that simple, there would be hundreds or thousands of other Steve Albinis that were able to do that exact same thing.
Well, I think there are. I think any competent engineer could do what I do from a technical standpoint. There are fewer and fewer competent analog engineers as time goes on, just because the recording paradigm has shifted into the digital realm to such a degree that no one really considers the initial task of recording something as being a significant task. Like now, that's all treated like a sort of a simple capture, just like, okay, just record something, whatever, we'll bring it in and we'll fuck around with it and make it cool, you know. And that's becoming a standard method. Working in the analog tradition, you have to get the sound right before you record it, or you know, the goal is to get the sound right before you record it, so that you haven't created problems that you then have to hassle with later. In the digital world, the power of the digital systems is so great, and manipulation capabilities are so great, that it's almost seen as an opportunity. Like, just get any old beep or fart on tape, you know, get something recorded, and then we'll go to town on it with all of these tools and make something amazing, right? And that's the viable method now. That didn't used to be a viable method in the analog era. What I do think that I do that has been a key part of my longevity is that I make it clear to my clients that they're in charge, and that whatever they want to do in the studio, whatever kind of an experience they want to have, whatever sound ambitions they have, that is their session, and they get to have that fulfilled. They get to realize those ambitions. I think part of that comes from me having been in a band and having seen my band and other people's bands not taken seriously by professionals, and the sting of insult that you feel when you have this aesthetic that you want to pursue, or you have this idea that you want to try, and someone who's a gatekeeper dismisses you and says you're not qualified to have that opinion, you're not qualified to direct the session or whatever. And I try very hard not to do that. There are two things two sort of moments that come to mind when I think about that. One of them was there was a band in Chicago that I was a big fan of. They were an inspiration to me, a band called the Effigies. They were a sort of big brother band to a lot of punk bands in Chicago in the early 80s. Meaning, when I say big brother band, meaning like they would set up a show and then they would have other bands come play with them, bands that they liked and that they got along with. And that provided those bands with an audience, gave them a leg up, gave them credibility, all of those things. They were participating in the scene in a very sort of, I don't want to say communal way, but in a cooperative way. They were part of a collective that formed a record label that my band put a record out on. That collective energy was a common theme in the punk scene at the time, like a bunch of people getting together to do something, whether it was put on a show or put out a record or, you know, any other enterprise. You'd get a bunch of people cooperating on something, you know, not professionally, not like to make money out of it, but as a way to get something awesome for the culture, you know. So they were an inspiration to me in a lot of ways. I love their music. I got along with them as people, and they had a couple of very distinctive elements, very driving, propulsive rhythm section, and a super aggressive, snarly guitar sound. Their guitar player had previously been in hard rock and heavy metal bands, but in the punk scene, he had this sort of overblown aggressive quality to his playing that was a function of the way his guitar sounded and the attitude that the band was trying to sort of generally express. So I had the opportunity to observe them in a studio session. They were friends of mine, and I wanted to learn more about studio stuff. So I went along with them into the studio to see what was going on in the session of theirs. And they were just setting up. Like, I set up the drums. The drums sounded fantastic. The bass player set up his setup. It sounded great. Earl was their guitar player, a guy I slightly idolized at the time. set up his amplifier, and he started playing, and it sounded fucking fantastic. You know, it was like, this is the band that I love playing the music that I love, and it's going to be great to see this in the studio. And through the glass in the studio, I saw the engineer having a conversation with Earl, the guitar player. Like, I don't know what transpired in that conversation, but there were sort of gestures here and there going back and forth, and Earl played a little bit of guitar, and then I saw the engineer reach over and turn the volume down on Earl's guitar amplifier, and then he started playing again, and it was clear that what was happening was the engineer was trying to make his life easier by not having a loud guitar creating problems in the room with the other instruments or whatever. And it instantly sounded weaker. It didn't sound familiar. It didn't have that the characteristic personalized sound that made me a fan of that band. It was some weaker, lesser version of it. Now, the important thing there is that this engineer who I'm friends with and who I admire as an engineer, he had the best intentions. He was trying to do right by that band. He thought that if the guitar was cleaner and clearer, that the band would make a better record, and he was trying to help. But because he was ignorant of their aesthetic, and because he wasn't part of their scene, and he didn't recognize that the distinctive element of that band was tied so heavily to the way that guitar sounded, he, with the best intention, he weakened that record. He weakened that session. And that kind of burned into me when I saw that happening. Like, that's something I'm not going to do. I'm never going to try to make something better for somebody from a position of ignorance, you know? And then another thing was, I was talking to Ian Mackay, who's another friend of mine. He was in the band Fugazi, and before that Minor Threat, and before that he was in a punk band called the Teen Idols. And he described a session that his band, the Teen Idols, had done, where he was in the studio room about to sing his vocals on one of their songs, and he saw the engineer through the glass, and someone had come to visit the engineer and was talking to the engineer, sort of making chit chat before he recorded this vocal tape. And he could see the engineer and his friend sort of mocking this session that he was working on, being dismissive of this session that he was working on, this ugly punk music. Like, yeah, this is what I'm reduced to. I'm recording this garbage punk music here, you know?
Yeah.
And that burned into Ian a kind of hatred of this superiority notion that engineers and producers have, where they feel like they know best what kind of music is. And that was a formative experience for him, and him relating that to me confirmed a lot of things that I felt at the time, which was that the punk era and the 80s underground music scene has some of the most distinctive, most amazing music that I've ever encountered. And a lot of those bands literally changed my life. I admired and was fascinated by a lot of that music. It was poorly documented because going into the studio to record something was an expensive enterprise, and not many bands got to do it. But it was also poorly documented because the engineers and producers of the day took it on themselves to mock and belittle and weaken these recordings because they didn't take them seriously. They didn't think this music counted. They didn't, you know, they were dismissive of it, and so they didn't take it seriously and they didn't respect it. And I have tried over a relatively long span to take seriously every kind of music that walks through the door here at the studio. I might not understand it. There's a high probability I won't understand it. But what I'm not going to do is assume that the people making that music are incorrect about their own music. I'm not going to assume that somebody's come in here with a bad idea. Bearing in mind that in the day, in the late 70s, early 80s, the way studios made a living, most of them, was by doing jingles, local radio and TV commercials, jingles, production music for industrial films, like voiceover stuff for 1,000 purposes. Like that kind of thing kept a lot of studios afloat. Recording music was reserved for studios that were working within the record label network, because recording music was so expensive relative to all these other things. Bands just didn't do it for themselves. It was really rare for a band to go into the studio and spend a month's wages to record 2 songs that no one would ever hear. You know, it was just an extremely rare thing. And, you know, it's hard to fathom now, but when I came to Chicago in 1980, like a top flight studio, a studio like Electrical Audio, like a fully capable multi-track studio, would have cost a band $1,000 or $1,500, maybe $2,000 a day for a studio like that with an engineer, right? And this was at a time when you could buy a new, you could buy a new car for $3,000. So if you imagine, like, scale up, what's the price of a new car now? You know, $30,000, $20,000? And then have that's what it would cost you to spend a day in the studio. So no one would do it, right? The only people who could do that were people who were funded, who were backed by a corporate label. So the smaller studios operated on the margins, where they were doing jingles and production music and, you know, stuff for churches and Muzak and garbage like that. That's how those studios survived. Once in a while, they'd get to do a music session that was kind of hip, you know, but that was it.
How much of an impact do you think around that time with the industry model as it was then, like you said, artists, that were going into big studios, it would be very much something that was part of the kind of major label setup and what the label had planned for that artist, it would all be to fulfill that vision. Was there then additional pressure on those artists, if they were being given that studio time in a big fancy studio, to come up with something that was potentially quite overblown and to really make use of the expensive facilities that they were given access to? Is that something that fed into that scene, or?
I can't speak for what those bands' aspirations were, but if your ability to function in your band is controlled by a corporate entity that has a decision tree, that decision tree is going to be executed by people who aren't musicians and aren't part of your world, like people who are just making guesses as to what they can sell. That corporate music world, I really have very, very little experience with. I've worked on a few records that were part of the big label scene. But I mean, relative to the amount of work that I do, like a daily basis, it's a vanishingly small amount of experience that I have. So I can't speak with authority about how those record companies and how those bands behave. I can only, I can postulate based on what I knew about the studio world and what I knew about the way my friends' bands were treated when they were in that environment.
And when you, on those rare occasions that you've worked with big, possibly major label artists on records, was Nirvana the first instance in which that happened for you, or had you kind of sampled working with artists from majors prior to the Nirvana record?
By the time I did the Nirvana record, I'd probably done maybe 4 or 5 records for what you would call major labels. I'd probably done 4 or 5 records for major labels at that point. the Nirvana record was the first time that I felt like there was actual animus between, rather than ignorance. Like I'd seen stupid things done, but I think they were done out of ignorance or done out of some sort of authorial pride, you know.
Yeah.
I felt like the band had created a paradigm where if other bands were allowed to follow that paradigm, it would be a threat to the control systems that the record labels had in place. That is, if the Nirvana went off on their own and made a record, delivered it to the record label, and if that record was successful, then that would be a model that other bands would try, where other bands would go off on their own, make a record, bring it back, give it to the label, and say we're done with it. Then, so there was an incentive for the big record labels to see that model fail.
And strange dichotomy, isn't it? Trying to follow one of the biggest records of all time.
I got to say, it was as weird as it seems now. It was weirder then to see a kind of a quiet publicity campaign almost to try to scuttle a record that a band that was going to be a huge record no matter what, right?
Yeah.
So it was really strange to see an active effort to undermine that record before it had even been released by the people who would benefit from it being successful. It was really strange. And to be stuck in the middle of it like that, you know, that was a pretty unpleasant period for me. I can't get past the fact that all of these people felt like their careers were tied to the success of the next Nirvana record. And they thought the very best thing that they could do was to shit talk the record behind the scenes. Like it kind of blew my mind. Like, you know, and that the thing is that effort, the sort of bad rapping the record behind the scenes, that was an effort to get Nirvana to capitulate and redo the record. That was an effort, a concerted effort by the record label and their management company and all the people whose fortunes were tied to it. It was a concerted effort to get them to abandon the work they'd done, go back and do it the way they wanted them to do it, right? When it became apparent that that wasn't going to work and that Nirvana were going to stick to their guns and put out the record they made because they were proud of it, then it became a weird position. Then it was a weird position. Like, well, we just told you this record sucked and we can't release it, but here it is, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very strange. And, you know, when you listen to the record now, the thing that's incredible is you listen to the record now and it just sounds like a regular record. It sounds, you know, there's nothing, I can't fathom what anybody could hear in that record that would get them up in arms, you know? If you compare it to one of those more like, you know, a slicker record or a more milquetoast record, I can see that it's different, but I also can't see, it's hard for me to see that any of those differences as like disqualifying, you know? I think the mythology of it has kind of grown over time as well. Like in the end, the band put out the record that they wanted to put out and the record label had to deal with it and it was a successful record. There are other bigger awkward moments in other people's careers. And I think it speaks very well of Nirvana that in the end they said, yeah, we were right. We wanted to make this record this way. It's great. We're putting it out. I think it speaks very highly of them that they stuck to their guns and that's what happened.
You talk about what a weird situation it was for you to be stuck in the middle of all of what was going on there. Did you get any sense of what it was like for them?
Only at the very outset of it. Like right after we finished the record, they turned the record over to their management people and the record label people. And very shortly afterward, I got a call from Kurt where he said, yeah, everybody hates the record. They don't want to put it out. They want us to redo it all. And I was like, you know, you kind of suspect that was coming, you know. And then he said, well, we have a few reservations about a couple of songs and we'd like to remix a couple of songs anyway. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I had a copy of the master. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll listen to everything here. And if I think I can do better on anything, then I'm willing to give it a shot. But if not, and you guys still want to remix some stuff on your own, you have my blessing. I'm not going to beef about it. It's just, I don't want to get into a scenario where, because you have done at their request, because it looks like at their request you have remixed a song or two, they can then sort of piecemeal get you to eventually redo everything. And I don't want to be a participant of that. That's going to be an ugly scene, and I don't want to deal with that. But I'll listen to everything and see if I can do any better. And I listened to everything, and I thought, I honestly felt like we couldn't do any better. Like, everything sounded impressive, and everything sounded distinctive and clear, and I thought it was a great representation of that aesthetic.
Yeah.
So I said, I don't think I can do any better. If you guys want to do if you want to do more work on it on your own, that's your business. But I don't think I can improve on anything. And in the end, they did remix a couple of songs, and those remixed versions made it to the album. And I think if you listen to them in the flow of the album, they don't stand out as being alien or weird, Mm-hmm. So I don't think that it hurt anything. And then 20 years later, Chris Novoselic and I had the master tapes here, and we did a whole alternate mix of the album just from listening to the multi-tracks again for the first time in 20 years. The idea was to create an alternate reality where, like, some choices that were made in the first instance would not be made this time around. Like, instead of using that guitar solo, use this guitar solo. Instead of leaving the backing vocal off, put the backing vocal on. Instead of having all of the cello there, take out some of the cello. Like, those kinds of decisions would create an alternate perspective on the record. And no one thinks that the version that was done 20 years later is the definitive version. And if you compare the two, it's obvious that the original record that was done with a continuous frame of mind is the stronger version. So I feel slightly vindicated in my feeling that I couldn't do better on remixing that material, because I 20 years later I tried and I couldn't do better.
How did you find them just as people to work with? Because presumably for you that was quite or was it a daunting project? I don't know. How did you feel knowing that this band, there was huge pressure to follow up Nevermind and all that kind of stuff, and the baggage that may have came with that? How did you find working with them in the studio?
There were a number of things that were on my mind when we started that session. The first one is, I didn't know these people. Like, I didn't have any interaction with them. I didn't have much interaction with them, but they were from the Northwest. I grew up in Montana. So there's like there's some shared experience there. They came up through the underground music scene at precisely the same time that I came up through the underground music scene. So there's a lot of shared experience there. We had a lot of friends in common, right? And our friends in common, the particular friends that we had in common, spoke highly of them. And that gave me some confidence in working with them. And from conversation, like their aesthetic, the things that they wanted to try for the record seemed right in line with what I'm good at. So that part of it seemed fine. And then once I got to meet them and see them in action, I grew to admire them tremendously during the course of that session, like the way that they interacted as a band. Kurt's aesthetic I thought was really interesting. Like, I thought his lyric choices were odd and unusual and distinctive. And I thought their level of preparation was great. Like, they were well rehearsed. They had been on tour, so they were playing well, and they knew the material well, and they had rehearsed it well. So there wasn't like a lot of faltering and faking in the sessions, like trying to figure stuff out on the fly. They knew what they were going to play, and they played it. Very old school in that regard, very, very much like all of the underground bands, because of the expense of going into the studio that I discussed. All the underground bands were pretty well steeled in this preparatory process where you get it ready and then you go into the studio so you're maximally efficient in the studio. And they were precisely like that. So that part of it was very familiar and very comfortable. We got along well on a personal level. And one of the other things that that was on my mind was that because they were such a big band, because they were a heavy influence on the music scene, and also there were a lot of people who sort of tied their careers to them. There were a lot of people who only had a job because they could do something for Nirvana or because they were associated with Nirvana. And so there were a lot of people clamoring to be part of what they perceived as a gravy train. And I wanted it to be absolutely unmistakable that I wasn't one of those people, that I wasn't going to try to latch on to them in any way. So I didn't press them for any kind of personal closeness. I didn't try to get involved in their lives on any personal level. I didn't offer them my advice in any matters that didn't directly affect me. I gave them a sort of a comfortable distance so that they could be themselves and not fear that I was going to be one of these people that was trying to glom onto them or trying to siphon something out of their thing. I wanted them to know that they had their thing and I was working for them as an employee, and I wasn't going to try to usurp any of their authority, and I wasn't going to try to, drink from their cup at all.
Yeah.
So those were the things that were on my mind before we started the session. I never felt any pressure about making a successful record. The only pressure I felt was like trying to satisfy the band, trying to make a good record,
Yeah. And how do you feel about the record when you listen to it back now, or whenever you last listened to it? Do you still feel affection towards that record? Has it been sullied in any way by the?
I mean, all that's all water under the bridge. All the hassle that I got into with the record label and stuff, that's all water under the bridge. None of those people have those jobs anymore. All those people are all selling insurance or something.
Yeah.
I have a good relationship with the band, the surviving members of the band. I like and admire them. I think that record is a great record. It's the biggest record that I will ever have been involved with. And so it's a significant record in terms of what I've done, but it's not my record, it's their record. And in that regard, I admire it, and I admire them for having stuck to their guns and making that record. If just listening to it, just as a listen, I think it's a really good, really great record.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I don't listen to records that I've worked on that often. There's something that feels slightly vain about that, and I don't like doing it. It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But when it comes up, when I do hear a record that I've worked on, if I'm someplace and a song from that record comes on the in the bar or whatever, I always think it sounds good. I always think it's good.
Yeah. And is there anything about the band or anything just from that time that you spent with them that stands out that you kind of wish people knew about them or about that record that you don't get asked?
One thing that I don't think people appreciate was how generous in spirit Kurt was with the other members of the band. Like it really felt like a band, like a cohesive band, rather than a songwriter who was calling the shots with backing musicians, So if somebody had an idea to try a variation on a part or try something different, Kurt had a very light hand. Like he wasn't authorial about what the other two guys were doing. He trusted them. And so I think that's evident in the confidence of their playing, and like the style of their playing seems very distinctive. It doesn't seem like it was directed. there's a kind of a naive assumption that because Kurt wrote the songs, that he sort of conducted everything and made everything happen the way it ended up. And he was an influence on it because he was in the band, but they very much felt like a functioning band where everybody in the band was trying hard to hold up their end of the bargain or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Moving on from Nirvana, I was wondering how you feel about your job today. Like you said at the start that you kind of got into the whole business of becoming a professional recording engineer kind of by accident.
Yeah.
Do you still feel the same kind of affection for the job and passion for the job when you're working on a record and it's coming together well and everyone's firing on all cylinders? Do you still get the same enjoyment and buzz from doing the job now that you did at the start?
I think when I was younger and I was doing studio sessions for the first time, there was more of a sense of accomplishment or surprise that something was coming out well. And it was sort of like, oh, listen to that we did there. Isn't that nice? And now I feel satisfaction when I do something and it comes out well. But I kind of feel like that should be expected of me. I have been doing this a long time. I have made a shit million records. It shouldn't be a shock that that you guys played your song and it comes out of the speaker sounding good. That should be kind of a baseline, So I don't have that kind of naive appreciation for the job that I did when I was still learning how to do it, right? The personal satisfaction that I see in other people, like when I see a band who has been, or particular member of a band who's been dreaming about going into the studio and making a record his whole life, and he's finally doing it, and he's hearing his music coming out of the speakers in a fancy studio for the first time, and it's satisfying to him. Like that joy, that elation is incredibly contagious, and I'll never not be charmed by that. The sense of satisfaction that somebody gets out of having their ideas realized in a tangible way, that's better than money.
Are there things that you do slightly differently now to how you may have done 20, 30 years ago? Like how's your gear evolved over the time? Do you come to rely on different pieces of equipment that have become mainstays for you now?
There's the most active thing that I'm having to do is that in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, it was rare, as I mentioned, for people to get into the recording studio and do any recording. So they would rehearse, and occasionally they'd have like a boombox recording or something of a rehearsal. But people didn't have a very firm conception of what a proper studio recording was going to be until they got into the studio and started working on it, right? Now, essentially essentially has access to recording equipment of one kind or another, even if it's just having GarageBand on your laptop or whatever. Essentially everybody can do some kind of recording of their music and make some kind of a maquette or a demo of what they're doing, and so they can extrapolate their ideas, and they can experiment with things to a much greater degree before they ever get to the studio. So one of the adaptations that I've had to make is that people come in with a fairly realized conception of what their music is supposed to sound like. And it's absolutely true that some of these demos that people make at home are quite well conceived and quite well executed, and that it's not trivial to do better than that in a fancy studio. That's not a trivial thing. If someone has spent a year working on honing a vision of something, using their private studio or recording setup, and we have 3 days to do a better job here, that's not trivial, So that's one adaptation that I've had to make, is I've had to figure out ways to satisfy people whose production ambitions can be quite lavish now, can be quite ambitious. They can be, pretty large. And then the amount of time that you have in a studio that you have to pay for by the day, like that can be put a lot of time pressure on you. The other big adaptation is that the styles of music that people play at any given time, a lot of them are going to be conversant with influences that I don't understand. Like they might be making reference to a particular era of club music that I'm utterly ignorant of. And so I need to be able to come up to speed very quickly. And like, what are the cliches that you're trying to avoid? What are the signifiers that you want to make sure that you have in here? Like, what do I not know about your music that's important, And that prevents me from making the sort of callous, clumsy blunder. Like it prevents me from reaching over and turning down the guitar player's amplifier, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And what kind of advice or tips would you have to any aspiring engineers who are looking at getting into studio work today?
The main thing is to just not quit, to just keep doing it.
Yeah.
When I started making recording, like the first recordings that I did would have been in the late 70s, like 78 or 79. And those would have just been a borrowed 4-track or rented 4-track machine with a rented microphone, recording everything under the sun to try to make some kind of music out of it, right? Then, a more competent version of that to record my friends' bands' demos and practice tapes and things like that. Then a more fully realized studio recording to try to make a record. Like that process took years. And then to the point where I was able to quit my job and be a recording engineer full time, that was a span of like 8 or 9 years before, from the point where I first started doing it to the point where I could say, yeah, this is what I do for a living. That was about 8 or 9 years, and I could have quit at any point in there. I could have just said, fuck it, this is not worth it. I'm not making any money at this. This is not, whatever satisfaction I have out of this is not worth the hassle. I could have quit anywhere along there, but because I didn't quit, I was able to build up a client base, which was effectively my peer group, the people that I knew anyway. So that's thing number one is just don't, if you believe that that's what you want to do with your life, if that's what animates you is making recordings of music, just don't stop doing it. You may not be getting paid for it. You may have trouble finding people willing to let you practice on them. You might just be recording yourself and your dog, or goofing around at home, but don't quit. Keep it up. The other thing is, I mentioned before that there was the fortunate timing of me getting involved in music was that I was embedded in a peer group of people, an underground music scene that was very cooperative and very collaborative. And so all around me, all of my friends were in bands and they were all playing music all the time. And so I could record things with my friends essentially at will. And I think that did a lot toward building my confidence and building my skill set. Just the fact that I was working with people that I understood and working with music that I understood. It wasn't some random thing that came in over the transom and I had to try to make sense of it. It was a peer group of people where we all had a similar aesthetic, or we at least understood each other's aesthetic. So if you can find people that think like you and work on music with them, then you will have an intuitive understanding of their music and you'll know whether you've dropped the ball or not. Whereas if you're just working on whatever random crap you can find, you might be doing a bad job and not know it.
Yeah.
You might be ingraining skills, ingraining into your practice something that's counterproductive, and you'd have no way of knowing it. So it's important to work on music that you understand with people that you can communicate with well, so that they won't be afraid to tell you that you're shitting the bed, but most of the time you'll notice when you've shit the bed because you're tuned in to what you're working on.
Yeah. That's good advice.
So those would be two main pieces of advice. Find people who think like you and work with them, and don't quit.